Hello everyone, today I am going to be teaching you a little bit about how rocket engines work. So to start it off, I'm going to give you a super simplified analogy to how an engine works. So to start it off, we are in the setting of my classroom with all the popular people in the classroom, which represents the combustion chamber, and all of the more popular people coming into the combustion chamber. And this exit right here represents a nozzle. Now let's say this little black dot down here represents me, and I walk into the classroom and start talking about all this random rocket science stuff that they don't understand. I start talking about it and none of them understand it, so they think this is a kind of awkward situation. So then all of the popular people leave the room. And this little door here is our nozzle, which all of the little people are going to walk out of. Now, if this were an actual rocket engine, all of these little people would represent the fuel, and that would represent the spark. So as all the people are leaving, they are going to be pushed out of the exit nozzle with an explosion if it was a real rocket engine. So all of that explosion, high pressure, coming out of that big area, which is the classroom, to that small area, out into the atmosphere, which is the outside, is going to create thrust. And this thrust is what is going to give us the delta V that is going to lift our rocket off of the launch pad and into the air. So now more and more people are coming into the classroom and are seeing me in there. So that means more and more people want to get out, which means we have more and more pressure being built up, resulting in much more thrust than we had at the beginning. So now we have a side-by-side comparison of the low thrust and the high thrust. With the low thrust, there are less people walking into the room and away from me and out of the nozzle, so there is less thrust to be provided to lift the rocket. Now, with the more people walking in, there's more pressure, which means that the more people are trying to get away from me, and more thrust is coming out of the nozzle, which means that it'll go faster, or it'll be able to lift heavier things. So now we move on to the topic of how do rocket engines actually work, besides a whole bunch of popular people trying to get away from me in a crowded classroom. So basically what a rocket engine is a bell-shaped, or besides aerospike, those are pretty interesting. It's a bell-shaped piece of metal with a nozzle connected to a tank of liquid oxygen and some sort of other fuel that is the main fuel of the rocket. Those two fuels will eventually mix together when they enter the combustion chamber of the rocket, and they will burn and create a controlled explosion, which is going to be forced out of the nozzle by high pressure, creating a thrust that is going to lift the rocket. And that thrust and the high pressure and the burning gases creates a little stream of fire coming out of the end of the engine. I've been doing a lot of talk about thrust and how that provides delta V for the rocket. But what exactly is delta V? So to explain it first, we have to talk about Tsiolkovsky's rocket equation. The rocket equation is basically delta V equals VE ln m0 over mf equals I sp g0 ln m0 over mf. But we're only going to be focusing on the delta V right now. Delta V is basically the change in velocity. So as you're sitting in the launch pad, you are traveling 0 miles an hour. Congratulations. So when you launch, 10 seconds later, you may be traveling 100 miles an hour. That is your change in velocity, 100 miles an hour. And let's say 300 seconds after that, you are traveling 3 times the speed of sound, which is about 2,300 miles an hour. Then your change in velocity then would be 2,200 miles an hour. There's a lot more about Tsiolkovsky's rocket equation that I may explain in a later video. So, to give you a little display of how a rocket's gimbal system works, I have this pen and its cap inverted to go on the ball point and tilt whichever way you need it to. So let's say we're traveling to space and our rocket suddenly tips a little bit. You don't want your rocket to blow up, right? So you have an onboard computer that tells this engine to tilt a little bit this way and get the rocket back up. And when the rocket is back with its head perfectly where you need it to be, the engine realigns itself and is in the correct position to keep your rocket up. But there's always turbulence when you're traveling, so this rocket will be traveling a little like this. It'll be a little shaky. And if it shakes too much, it'll explode. That's called vibration damage, which I'll probably cover in a later video. But this engine will make minor adjustments to steady out that vibration and give you a nice smooth ride to space. Now, we cover the orbital part of this, not too in depth, but I'm going to give you the little example with this. So as you travel up, you need to get to an orbit. And when you go up, you're going to start to pitch over, and this engine will control that. It'll do slight adjustments and pitch you over until you're nearly horizontal, and you establish an orbit where your rocket is going to be traveling around the Earth like this. That's a geostationary orbit, and I will cover that in a different video. Now let's go over all we've covered today about rocket engines. First, we had the example of a whole bunch of popular people coming in a constant flow to a classroom with me, and they're all rushing to get away from me as fast as they can. That is thrust. All those people are going to rush out of the door and create pressure and lift our rocket out of the air. Next, we went over low thrust and high thrust and how a small amount of people with a small constant flow will create low thrust and low pressure coming out of the nozzle, and how a large constant flow with a large amount of people in the classroom with me will create a high amount of pressure, and all of the people will come flowing out quickly. Then we went over Ciolovsky's rocket equation and the delta V, which is the change in velocity, and that is provided by thrust. And we went over how if you're going 0 miles an hour and then you go 100 miles an hour, your change in velocity would be 100 miles an hour. And lastly, we went over the gimbal system and covered how the gimbal system corrects minor adjustments and major adjustments in the rocket and gets you to orbits. Thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned, and if this video gets enough likes, I will create another more in-depth video on how rocket engines actually work and a more in-depth version of how their combustion works and how the rockets actually get to space. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you later. Peace!